Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
So, Dr. Gonzalez-Tennant, thanks for coming on ArcPod. ArcPod, I'm reading my name instead of... Okay. Hello, welcome to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 104. This is your host for today, Paul Zimmerman. Our usual host, Chris Webster, can't be with us today because he is currently on a CRM project in Arizona near Yuma, right along the border. He wants us to know that no, he's not working on the border wall, though he is, however, right in visual distance of the actual border itself and the fence or wall, slat fence, I guess, as it is, that's currently down there. It sounds like some very interesting work that he's been doing. I'm not sure if he'll be at liberty to discuss it in the future, but if he can, we'd probably like to get him on our own show to discuss what he's doing. Instead of Chris being here today, I get the joy of interviewing Dr. Edward Gonzalez-Tennant. Dr. Gonzalez-Tennant is a lecturer in anthropology at the University of Central Florida. He also serves as the principal investigator with Digital Heritage Interactive, LLC. He's published numerous articles and chapters on the intersection between digital archaeology, social justice, and public outreach. His recent book, The Rosewood Massacre, An Archaeology and History of Intersectional Violence, is currently available in hardcover from the University Press of Florida. A paperback version will be published later this year, 2019. We'll post Dr. Gonzalez-Tennant's email address and other information on the show notes, of course. And today we're going to discuss with him some of the work that he's been doing, because he does an interesting job combining storytelling, digital storytelling, various digital kinds of data collection and representation. And I think it's really stuff that'll be up our alley here on Archaeotech. So, Dr. Gonzalez-Tennant, thanks for coming on the Archaeotech Podcast. Really pleased to have you here today. Chris sends his apologies. He can't be here because he's currently in the field. The project he was supposed to be on and back by the time of this recording got pushed back a week, so he's scrambling to try to get everything reassigned and rescheduled. And right now he's in southern Arizona. Anyhow. Oh, wow. Chris has had on our Trello stack your name, a scan of your business card since at least since when I started co-hosting this podcast. And I think it was on there for a little bit beforehand. And he's been really excited to have you on the podcast because he wanted to talk to you about GIS, said that you were an expert in GIS and a big proponent of open source. And, those are things that are right up our alley. But then as he started handing me some of the notes and I started looking at your website, it looks like GIS is certainly not your only thing, though I suspect it's one major component of what you do, and that you're actually doing some very interesting work with digital heritage writ large. So would you like to tell our listeners what it is that you're currently working on?
Yeah, of course. Please call me Ed. Thanks for having me on. I would frame what I do as digital archaeology in a very broad sense. So definitely a longtime user of GIS. I've taught GIS. I've done it as a sort of professional archaeologist in the CRM world for a few years. So that continues to always inform a lot of the work I do. It's really that sort of geospatial component is often, I guess, the foundation of anything I do. But of course, that broader digital heritage world includes things like 3D modeling and virtual world environments. And that's another, I guess, arena that I've spent a lot of time and effort working on. So things like the virtual Rosewood or virtual VR Rosewood Heritage Project. I've sort of changed the name of it a few times over the years, trying to figure out what I'm trying to highlight with the work. I'm working on a whole new version of that, which will be coming out in the next few weeks. Much more immersive, much more interactive. We're actually finding ways of using, these tools and technologies that are basically video game engines, right? Same software used by people who make video games to deliver not just a visual representation of past landscapes and sites, but also more clearly embed the types of data. And I think really more importantly, how archaeologists, historians use that data to make decisions about things like what does a structure look like, where is it or why is it placed on a landscape, all of those sorts of things. And so we're kind of rebranding that, calling that Rosewood an interactive history, and thinking about that name change. It really is all about finding a way to let people explore this world on their own and draw into that experience nearly 15 years of historical and archaeological and even oral testimony research that we're using to drive those reconstructions. And then, of course, all of those skill sets that, I'm using on that one project allow me to wear, sort of dual hats, one as a researcher and an academic, but also one as a consultant with Digital Heritage Interactive. And so I'm using those skills and applying them to all sorts of different sites, all sorts of different time periods, really, and finding ways to use these digital technologies, these digital tools to do really like socially relevant work, but always based on, the evidence, based on, I hesitate to champion this is a science-based thing too much, but, that's the goal here is if we talk about something, if the goal is to do public outreach and socially relevant stuff, and that really is my goal that animates all my work, having it be evidence-based, I think adds a crucial level to that, and one that when we go out and do archaeology in the community, or I do a public talk or whatever, the fact that people can look at those tangible things, and understand how we're working from things like field notes to a virtual reconstruction of a house and all the little decisions that go into that, that's not something that we necessarily reveal very well to the public as historical researchers. So that's sort of where I'm trying to exist and move around that, I guess, those various areas or terrains, or that big cloud that I think encompasses all the permutations of digital heritage or digital archaeology.
No, that's great. That's actually very much in line with what other people I've discussed who do things like digital humanities are in, is trying to, or a certain experimental aspect to it, dealing with a whole bunch of different kinds of digital technologies, but always in the service of something else. The digital isn't the be all end all of it. It's the particular tool set. And then there's the experimentation that goes along with that, the various kinds of tool sets, the expertise that goes into learning, say, Blender or QGIS or some particular software package or hardware for that matter, and trying to wrestle those tools in service of a broader goal. Before we get too far into the weeds here, though, could you just define for us quickly what Rosewood is and why it's important? What's its historical significance to a listener who might not know?
Yeah, absolutely. So Rosewood was an African-American community located here in Florida along the Gulf Coast. So if one's familiar with Rosewood, this would be about 2 hours north of where modern-day Tampa is. So this was a relatively prosperous African-American or Black town. And I say prosperous in the sense that citizens there were able to own property, own businesses, educate their children, all of those sorts of things. Perhaps not wealthy, but I still think prosperous fits. It's well known in many ways, very unfortunately, because of the events of the first week of 1923, which have been referred to as the Rosewood Race Riot. So this is a week-long series of events, violent events that basically culminate in the complete destruction of every Black-owned building and the violent displacement of the local African-American population. And this is all triggered by an initial event on Monday, January 1st, 1923, when a white woman in neighboring Sumner receives injuries from her extramarital lover, And we know that this is likely what occurred based on eyewitness testimony, people who were there at the time and later gave oral history recordings or interviews, sorry. So instead of admitting to an extramarital relationship or affair, the white woman constructed what at the time would have been a convenient lie and blamed an African-American man. That sends the local community, the local white community, who'd been reading incendiary accounts of African-American violence in the previous months across the state of Florida. And this sort of really drives escalation of violence over the following days that, as I mentioned before, culminates in the complete destruction of the town. It's interesting, or it's important, I guess, in a lot of ways historically, because Rosewood, and even though the state of Florida wouldn't necessarily term it this way, Rosewood is one of the first and perhaps one of the only communities to receive monetary compensation. There have been similar movements at some other sites like Tulsa, Oklahoma, but here in Florida, a state legislature decision in the 1990s awarded both monetary compensation to survivors and the descendants, but also did things like establish a scholarship for the descendants of Rosewood to go to college. So even though that was termed the Rosewood Compensation Bill, it really has become sort of a classic example of African-American reparations in the U.S. And so Rosewood is a relatively rural town, never incorporated, so there's nothing like the traditional Sanborns or plat maps or anything like that. So understanding the spatial relationship of the town was a particular challenge, and something that archaeology was uniquely suited to address.
Well, it's interesting that you're using archaeology because, normally I would think that something this recent, just under 100 years, I mean, I know that 50 years old is the federal limit, but generally this recent, it would fall mostly under history rather than archaeology. But you're using archaeological tools to study this tragic series of events in American history, and digital archaeology in particular. Could you go into some of the details of what kinds of tools you're bringing in to study and, I suppose, document and record the events at Rosewood?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so, as a historical archaeologist, the last century, there are obviously a growing number of people who work in that period, but certainly when the public, even practitioners here, or use the term archaeology, that is pretty recent. Part of the reason why archaeology is useful here, particularly the mixed methods approach within historical archaeology, which has always sort of used three types of data alongside one another, obviously, like archaeological data, artifacts, that sort of stuff, but also documents and oral testimony. That combination is particularly useful in Rosewood. Again, there's no plat maps, Sanborns, nothing that we could just sort of grab and very quickly understand the spatial layout of the community. So going into the documentary and archival record, specifically property deeds, reconstructing the metes and bounds of those properties for really initially a 50-year period from 1870 to 1930. This is really reviewing thousands of deeds, reconstructing hundreds of metes and bounds descriptions, and then basically bringing all of that into a GIS, using that as a historical properties GIS, but also as a predictive model to help us understand where specific structures may or may not have been. And in the last 10 to 12 years, when we've really been doing more and more archaeology out there, we've tested or done work at sites that we believed had structures, but we also, wanted to check those places that we thought would not. And so far, that combination of archival and archaeological work has done really well in allowing us to locate a variety of different structures. I mean, we're also going into more, I don't know if I want to say traditional, but, we're using some remote sensing technology. So we do have access to the African-American cemetery in Rosewood, or at least one of them. So we have done ground penetrating radar or GPR work there. We'll actually be back out this summer to continue doing archaeological work. We have a sizable grant from the State of Florida Division of Historical Resources, which is funding all of those excavation, sort of traditional archaeological work. So that includes doing more GPR at other sites, and then going in and, of course, doing more excavations. And so what we're learning about Rosewood is, in some ways, this is archaeology to reconstruct what the town was like, but it's also archaeology to get the public interested and understanding that, what we think of as a town today is not necessarily what people who lived in the town 100 years ago thought of it. So in terms of how close structures are to one another, the types of material culture that people would have had access to. I think a lot of people assume there would be big differences in the material culture between Black and white Americans. The historical archaeology in sort of the 19th and 20th century is showing that that's often not the case, or if it is the case, it's pretty negligible, mainly because this is an era of the Sears catalog and the mail order. You get access to the same stuff. So, yeah, I mean, it's, without archaeologists were early adopters. New technology comes out, we swarm it.
Right.
Yeah, this was definitely the case with GIS. We're one of the first social science or humanities. And, I think there are archaeologists who fit into both. And sometimes that's a single person who fits into both, a science and humanities discipline. But we've been using GIS, 30 something years now as a discipline, doing the same thing with 3D technologies, remote sensing technologies. And so historical archaeology, which has worked with the documentary record, people who do that even call themselves documentary archaeologists. All of these sorts of things come together really well to analyze, these ephemeral towns, these ephemeral Black towns, which were so much more common, particularly in rural locations up until the early and mid 20th century across the U.S. So to illuminate that history, that even though it's at the edges of living memory now, but even a generation or two ago, it was very much within living memory.
Right.
And yet we've completely, as a society and a country, largely, I guess, if not completely, but largely erased, forgotten, but there's obviously some intentional aspects to that forgetting, just how common this type of a life, these types of communities really were. I had the pleasure recently of being at a symposium at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, that brought together a group of scholars doing this type of mapping Black towns. That was the name of the symposium. And, in some places like Texas, people have identified 500 or more historical Black towns, the vast majority of which no longer exist, or if they exist, it's one or two structures. Maybe it's a historical marker, but they're not the same sort of vibrant communities they were a century or so ago.
Don't even know how to summarize this, because it sounds like you're doing quite a bit of work that's touching on a bunch of different methodologies and a bunch of different tools, and for a few different purposes. But I do like this engagement idea that you're talking about here. This is maybe a minute or two earlier than you normally would, but you, as we were discussing before, you are also involved in public outreach as a component of the work that you do. So why don't we go to break, and when we come back, we can discuss how you're going about engaging the public in the research, particularly around Rosewood, but whatever other research you've been doing and continue to do.
Hey everybody, here Chris Webster with one of our sponsors, WildNote, and this is your WildNote tip of the month. So when you're using WildNote, you can add to any one of the forms that you create a location-based field. That means you can drop a point. You don't need any service. All your tablets have GPS on them if you have a cell card in there, but the cell card does not need to be enabled. But if you drop that point, you'll get a latitude and longitude. And if you have connectivity, you can sync that, and people in the office can actually keep track of what's been accomplished for the day. For example, you can drop a point at the beginning and end of a transect, or on a shovel test, or something like that. And you can literally put them anywhere and all over your forms. And then they can see that in a gallery view, or wait till you upload at the end of the day and then see that progress as you're doing it. So head on over to wildnoteapp.com to start your free 30-day trial. That's wildnoteapp.com. Chris Webster here to talk about one of our affiliates with the Archaeology Podcast Network. Affiliates help you and they help us. So head on over to archpodnet.com/side hustle. If you want to do something extra with your time, or maybe you even want a different career for a little while, maybe you need something to hold you over for the winter, then check out arcpodnet.com/side hustle. A friend of mine has a website called indemandcareer.com because that's what it is. It's digital marketing. You'll learn everything about social media, all the trends, how to get clients, and how to help them increase their social media and marketing efforts online. You can do all that from your hotel room. So check it out at arcpodnet.com/side hustle.
Welcome back to the Archaeotech podcast. As we finished up the last segment, I was teeing up a question about public outreach, and you're doing a lot of work not just on digital collection and modeling and GIS work and so on, but outreach is definitely an important component of the work that you've been doing. So I was wondering, what role do digital technologies, things like digital storytelling, VR, and so on, play in collaboration for you?
Well, actually, this is a really important aspect that I think often gets overlooked with the potentials when we talk about digital archaeology. So obviously, I'm doing things, and we've done things where we create virtual reconstructions for museums and stuff. But I think, again, I'm going to return to Rosewood and a story that's happened out there that's really illustrative of the true potentials of this stuff. So I've done digital storytelling and oral histories. We've done a lot of that work actually with the descendant community. When I started this project, actually 2 of the survivors were still alive. So these were 2 African-American women who were physically present in Rosewood in 1923. They were different ages. One was 3, one was 7 or 8. They've both since passed away. But I had the opportunity to do oral histories with them, and that ended up forming the core of a digital documentary that I created. This was years ago now. It is on the virtualrosewood.com website. It looks pretty hokey. But I created it specifically to kind of talk about the history of Rosewood, the research we were doing for bus tours that some of the descendants run into the area around Rosewood. And so I did this as a way, it's a 45-minute bus ride out to the site from the nearest sort of large town, Gainesville, Florida. So I created this little documentary that they could play on the buses. And then I put that online, and, that along with some initial versions of the virtual world, started to get a lot of media coverage here in Florida. So a number of large newspapers ran stories about it. And after a few months, I actually was contacted. This opened up or invited somebody to contact me, and it turned out to be the individual, the man who owns the property where the African American cemetery is located. And so he reached out because he saw the video, he saw the virtual reconstructions, all of this generated from the newspaper account that he read. He reached out, he invited us onto his property, so that by 2012 we actually started doing some basic work, some GPR work in the years that have followed, and all of that connection, that access, none of that likely would have materialized because he had worked with researchers, academics specifically, in the past and had a very negative experience. And so I think if I had not sort of started with the digital side of this, I don't think I'd be having the same levels of access. I don't think I would have had the doors open, and in the years since, the rapport built that I've been able to do in Rosewood, a place where, quite frankly, previous researchers and academics have sort of poisoned the well of collaboration. The digital technologies not only provided a way to sort of mend those fences, but also just really greatly accelerate our ability. And so now we know all sorts of people, and the local community is now much more interested in having a conversation about this. And so that's really a powerful, I think, example.
Yeah, that sounds like a great example of what we always hope happens, which is the archaeology informs the community informs the archaeology, the archaeologist increases the archaeology that can be done, and then becomes a collaborative back and forth between one group supporting the other, both working towards some sort of a common goal. What do you think it is about the digital technologies in particular that that allowed you this greater access that that other archaeologists weren't able to get because of whatever personal or methodological tools they were using?
Well, I mean, I can certainly relate why this one individual reached out. And I think partly it was because in the video, I'm very upfront about why I'm doing the research and what I hope to accomplish. So there was no sort, and this was, very publicly stated for posterity. And it resonated with this individual. And, it was, and this has always been my interest. And it's a big part of what we're doing this summer when we're out there for a month doing excavations, is I've always wanted to move the story of Rosewood and this type of a project beyond the single event which destroyed the town. It didn't destroy the community. The family stayed in touch. They had Rosewood family reunions. They still do that to this day, right? The community wasn't destroyed. It was just the built environment that was destroyed. And so I wanted to talk about what came before, what happened after, but also expanded to talk about the neighboring community of Sumner, which often gets represented as sort of the white town to Rosewood's black town. But in fact, Sumner was probably more 50% white, 50% African-American. And so actually a lot of the work we're doing this summer is moving into Sumner and starting to do archaeological work there and really talk about all of these communities. And so, the digital technologies provided me, I guess, a venue or a platform in a very real sense to talk about, look, I'm not just here to sort of point fingers at local whites and call them nasty names. There's a very interesting history out here that precedes and follows this event. And I think that we're doing short service by not following both of those. And of course, digital technologies allows me to, now that we're working in Sumner, target properties. Sumner's a company town. It's a sawmill town. It's a completely different sort of social structure than Rosewood, which was a mixed economy and we can see a lot of this embedded in the documents. But of course, those of us who do archaeology and do public outreach, we know that when we bring that out there and we have members of the public see this and we do the public talks, we show them the artifacts, we show them all this stuff, it just resonates. That tangible aspect of archaeology is so much more powerful. I think that's another thing that resonates with folks as well. I wasn't just going out to do a history and talk to a few people and then write my book and then sort of, bye. I was very much interested. And by the time that he had reached out, we started working on his property. I'd been doing this work for 6 or 7 years already. So,
all right, so that
I think
that longevity, that contact.
Yep, that sustainable aspect is really important.
So not strictly the digital, but the way that you're using the digital tools in a long-term project and with a sensitivity to the local community.
Well, and basically none of those things, theory, method, digital, outreach, none of that gets to supersede any other aspect. They really all have to operate hand in hand, and I move them forward simultaneously.
No, I like that. That's a great approach. Quick kind of methodological question here. You said that the material culture of the black communities and the white communities isn't especially differentiated. Are you then finding in this other town? Are you finding the material? Are you expect to find material cultural differences, or are you finding the white owned homes and the black owned homes based off of historical documents?
I need to probably So in terms of the homes, this is what I think we're going to see a difference in Sumner, but I think the difference we're going to see in terms of size of homes, how they're arranged on the landscape, all of that sort of stuff, it's going to be much more a structural thing in the sense that, the company owns the town. And so they designed the town. But there are some, and I do briefly sort of talk about this for a few pages in the book. What is interesting is the cemeteries. So the white cemetery that would have been associated with both Rosewood and Sumner is still in use today. People are still being buried there. There's a fence around it, but everyone tells us that there's more burials. So one of the first things we're going to do this summer is you GPR there and tried to really locate the historical boundaries of that cemetery. But when you compare this, these ostensibly black and white cemeteries, if, folks who are familiar with like African American folklore or cemetery burial traditions, there's a lot of decoration of graves that occur with like shells or glass or broken dishes or plates or all of this sort of stuff. And so shells have been a big part of many African American burial traditions in parts of the southern U.S. But here in this part of Levy County, if I took you to the white cemetery or the black cemetery, and you were operating under the assumption that, well, black cemeteries are decorated this way and white cemeteries are, in this area, that's actually reversed. So shells, pottery, all this stuff is prolific at the white cemetery and almost completely lacking at the African American cemetery. And so trying to understand, so there are actually differences. I don't want to suggest that there are none. In terms of the homes, those differences are probably more economically or structurally driven. But in terms of the cemetery, there's something very interesting and potentially, I think, at the regional, even national level, something very unique happening. So again, we're doing, one of the things we'll do this summer is probably we'll fly our drone, we'll do photogrammetry, and on our, I don't know if the students will be into this, but on our downtime, we're going to create or try to create a digital reconstruction of the, quote unquote, white cemetery so that people can sort of see and experience and visit this site, even if they can't get out there locally. And that's something I've done, elsewhere. When I worked in the Caribbean, we actually reconstructed an entire Jewish cemetery on the island of Nevis. And so you can walk through, you use photogrammetry, total station map, all these, sort of traditional and new emerging tools in archaeology to create a virtual world of how this Jewish cemetery, you can literally, virtually, figuratively walk around.
Nice catch.
Walk around this Jewish cemetery. And as you do, you can click on the tombs and pull up information with translations of what's there. So finding a way, again, to use digital technologies to make sites that may not be accessible to people because of distance or whatever, accessible and make them a learning resource and a public outreach resource simultaneously. That's something else we'll be doing more of in Rosewood and Sumner, and I continue to do that elsewhere as well.
That's very interesting work. How do you disseminate the reconstructions that you're doing? It sounds to me like it's not good enough just to do it, but as public outreach is an important component of the work that you're doing, you've got to actually get your work out to the public, both to show what you're doing and for feedback, for criticism, for compliments, whatever it takes. How are you actually managing that part of the project?
Okay, see, that's a great question, because I think a lot of folks who do this sort of work, there's some vital steps that we don't, as archaeologists working in these domains, we probably don't take enough time to deal with. So the feedback, right? And I'm sort of looking at interaction design. I have a paper that I'll be doing at the Computer Applications and Quantitative Methods in Archaeology conference later this month. I'll be having to do it in absentia because I won't make it to Poland for the conference. But talking about how do we get this feedback? How do we engage the communities that can either inform or will be the user bases for these reconstructions? And so I've explored a variety of different ways of doing this. A big one is to have a public event and literally walk the audience through the virtual reconstruction as we're all sitting in the room and get their feedback, and use that as, almost a final step. So get everything in the reconstruction almost finished and then share it with various communities. So, the feedback you get is very mixed. Some of it is great. Some of it can be a little strange, depending on the sites you're working at. But, people are very quick to recognize if the vegetation is wrong or the landscape looks unfamiliar. Basically, if you're not paying attention to those sorts of details, those are things that user communities pick up on very quickly. And then, of course, the reason I am investing more and more in revealing the design decisions, which really for archaeologists, historians, when we work from various data sets to interpret what a structure looked like, what a site looked like, the arrangement of X, Y, and Z, all of those decisions that we develop, we teach each other how to do, we understand, those are obfuscated for the most part when it comes to the public or various communities accessing those final interpretations. So that's where I'm now moving with a lot of my work, is finding ways, at least in the sort of VR virtual world realm, finding ways of uncovering or revealing those design decisions. I mean, I'm calling them design decisions, but there are interpretive decisions. And so letting the public know, yes, there is conjecture involved here, but it's not fanciful. When we talk about the homes in Rosewood, there's, sometimes we know what they look like because we have oral histories with the people who live there. And so, is that going to give me an exact dimension? No. But if I do archaeology, is that necessarily going to help? Sometimes. But these are foundationless homes. They're what we call locally and colloquially cracker architecture. So they're on supports, right, to allow airflow. So, there is some conjecture, but then it also gets based on architectural history. So we do that work. And then just revealing to the audience, to the users, to whatever, whomever, however, stakeholders, whatever I'm calling those different groups, okay, we painted this house because the child who lived here, when we interviewed her 85 years later, she was struck by the color of the house and she remembers it being painted. And this was something that her family was proud of because so many other houses weren't painted. Those are the details that we sift together and bring together, and finding a way to reveal that decision making to the public. I think all of those things are a big missed potential for archaeologists working at this. And I'm not saying that no one else is doing it, but I don't think enough of us is doing it. And then, of course, when they're finished, to get back to your original question, we put them on websites with Rosewood and Interactive History. You can always get this stuff through sort of virtual Rosewood. It'll always link, but I'm thinking likely we'll be releasing that final version on itch.io, right? So a big indie game marketplace where people put all sorts of video games and interactive novels and text-based adventure, all of those sorts of things. And so hopefully that'll open up a whole new user community or group of folks who'll come to these reconstructions. Because when I started doing this work, it was in very much, in a very real sense, driven by the descendant community that I was working with. Because we were brainstorming about how do we make the history of Rosewood relevant. And and in hindsight, and I can admit this now, I sort of flippantly suggested, why don't we virtually reconstruct the whole town? This was circa 2007, 2008. I didn't really understand what that meant. I didn't. I thought I did. I didn't. I did not realize how much information it would really, and when I try to communicate this to other archaeologists, well, let me back up. So when I suggested that to the descendant community, they loved it. And that was a big part of the reason I started exploring this technology, some of which, like GIS and the geospatial foundations, I knew. The 3D modeling, the virtual world stuff, I'd played with, but then it became a focus based on what the descendant community wanted. But then when I talked to other archaeologists, I think a lot of us forget just how involved that is. And so the analogy I like to use now is, think about when you go to a park or a museum that reconstructs a site. What's the color of the doorknob? What kind of chair is there? All of those little design decisions have to be made. And unfortunately, we don't find a lot of information in the archaeological record that gets us to that detail. So that's where we have to stay multidisciplinary. That's where architectural history, but also for me, visiting historic sites, mining the photographic archive, all of that stuff plays a part. And then I can reveal this is where my conjecture is coming from.
Great. Well, why don't we take a little break here because I have a bunch of questions now. It sounds like you're doing taking a very holistic and iterative approach to the work at all stages of it. So I'd like to find out on that notion of iterative work, where you expect this to be going and how you expect to improve upon it in the future.
Hey everyone, Chris Webster here with the Archaeology Podcast Network. And if you like what you're hearing, considering becoming a member and supporting us, go over to arcpodnet.com/members and support us at the supporting member level, standard member, or professional member. You can do $5, $10, or $20 a month, and you can do those yearly at $42, $84, or $168 per year. Again, that's arcpodnet.com/members for more information. Get early downloads, show stickers, and a whole bunch of other swag. Hey everybody, Chris Webster here from the Archaeology Podcast Network to talk about Timular, one of our affiliates. Head over to arcpodnet.com/Timular. Click through there and you'll see this 8-sided cube that I use for tracking all my time as a project manager, all my time between the Archaeology Podcast Network and everything else I do. All you do is label the sides and then you flip it for each thing that you do, and it tracks your time exactly. You're able to export that as an Excel spreadsheet or CSV file to add to your timesheets. So if you're doing project tracking or any sort of tracking, then use Timular. If you're out in the field, you can actually use it on just your mobile device as well. So get Timular at arcpodnet.com/Timular. Help support them and support archaeological education and outreach.
Welcome back to the Archaeotech Podcast. This week, because Chris isn't here, instead of doing an App of the Day segment, and because I'm having such a good time hearing what Dr. Gonzalez-Tennant has to say about the work that he's doing in digital heritage, public outreach, and especially around the site of Rosewood in particular, I has a few extra questions, and we're going to go into a third segment. Hopefully he can enlighten us on a few things, like what is the future of the Rosewood project? Ed?
Okay, well, so the future is, again, like the past, it's multi-pronged. So we're doing the big, massive virtual world update, and that should be out sometime in April of 2019. Mm-hmm. And that'll be the immersive, the interactive stuff that you'll be able to get at virtualrosewood.com, but also itch.io. We're also doing, more traditional archaeological work. So we'll continue to have the public outreach component that comes along with that. We'll have people visiting us while we do excavations and GPR work out in Rosewood and Sumner and the areas in that part of Levy County. Mm-hmm. Part of the grant we have is also funding the construction of a professional documentary. So whereas I sort of incorporated digital storytelling and sort of made a digital documentary several years ago, which again is fairly hokey, we're going to do something much more professional and make this available to the PBS stations, the public broadcasting stations here in Florida. And wonderful. What we'll do is we'll use that to drive more public outreach. So we'll do a premiere of that documentary in fall of 2019, so this fall, out in Cedar Key, which is the nearest town to Rosewood today that's still populated or occupied or a town. We'll be helping the local history museum, the Cedar Key Historical Society, create an exhibit, not just about Rosewood, but about African-American history in that area more broadly. And then, of course, the documentary will talk about the history of Rosewood, but also talk about how these different digital technologies, the geospatial ones, the various recording technologies, traditional approaches like excavation, and all the new digital technologies like 3D modeling and virtual worlds allow us to communicate this. So really, in some ways, a massive update to the first digital documentary, but also kind of summarizing for a more popular or public audience the type of research that went into the book, the type of research that is animating this. And of course, the point with all of this is really to help ground and even drive public conversations in Rosewood and elsewhere around reconciliation, these sort of difficult histories. And I think when people encounter this and have, an interaction with a visual representation, it just makes everything that much more real for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the virtual itself isn't necessarily enough. The human interaction, the meeting people face to face, the taking feedback, all that really goes into any successful project, I guess. Especially one that, like what you're doing with people who are just outside of living memory, descendant communities of the site. For lack of a better word, I feel a little weird talking about just like a site. It sounds a little sanitary. Of the town that you're studying. That said, what can other archaeologists do to engage in this type of work? I mean, at any stage of this, what do you think, if you could wave a magic wand and have other archaeologists behave better and do better work, what would you do?
I think it is all about experimentation, methodological experimentation. I think that, academic departments, when we're training archaeologists, we often do short shrift methodologies unless you happen to be studying with the one person who's an expert or the department that's renowned for this. And I'm not saying that everybody who's a professor or lecturer or whatever of archaeology has to be a methodologist, but finding ways to give students or encourage students to have that methodological freedom, that experimentation. So sometimes that could be as easy as, talking to students, what are you interested in? Oh, I've been doing this sort of work. I'm interested in film or YouTube videos or 3D modeling or whatever it is. And then just finding a way to integrate them into your project. I mean, that's the sort of reciprocal thing where educators and students get to learn more. But then, of course, flipping this out past the educational arena, which is, of course, not the only place this stuff happens. I think, professionally speaking, again, finding ways to make room in a professional setting for this sort of experimentation is crucial. The nice thing is, when I first started doing this work, really in some ways 2005, 2007, my first virtual reconstruction of Rosewood was actually constructed in 2005 using, I think then it was Google SketchUp, which I think is now Trimble SketchUp or just SketchUp. Anyway, it looks awful. It looked awful. And it was me experimenting with it. But of course now, a few years later, I went to 3ds Max, which was free as an academic or a student or whatever. But during that time period, using open source tools was really difficult. Right. Some of them really weren't up to the tasks in some way. But in the last decade or so, open source tools like Blender is fantastic. I only use Blender now. I would never go to another program to do 3D modeling. In fact, I even edit my videos with Blender because it has a video sequence editor built in. I mean, it's such a powerful program, and I don't have to worry about copyright issues or any of that sort of stuff. For years now, I'm doing the same with GIS and all the geospatial stuff. So I've moved. In fact, all of the Rosewood material, I just finished this a few months ago. I've brought it out of the geodatabase format that I had, very ESRI focused, and I've brought it into, again, mostly shapefiles, but I brought it into an environment where I can now do all the same work I used to do with paid software, the geospatial stuff with QGIS, with free and open source geospatial software. So I think encouraging people to branch out, be experimenting with these open source tools. And I know that a lot of folks doing digital archaeology, digital history, digital heritage are doing this sort of stuff. And I think that's one of the big keys. And just finding ways wherever you're at to open that experimental space is hugely important. And then I think a lot of that other stuff's going to follow, right? You start doing this, the public outreach, the social relevancy, all of that gets amplified or magnified when you do these, these alternative or these digital things.
Right. What you're saying, I've heard from a number of other people who work heavily in digital humanities in particular, but that the boon that they feel of having really high quality open source tools available to them, and as teaching tools, as experimentation, the playfulness that they can bring to bear when they're not spending tens of thousands of dollars on software to lock them into a particular system is really important. I mean, I feel from a lot of people that it's even an ethical obligation. And from what I'm hearing from you, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you feel very similarly.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This past weekend, I took some students out to survey some sites here in Central Florida, mostly prehistoric sites, actually, because in my department, I'm the only archaeologist who works in Florida. So, those students who have an interest in Florida, we gravitate towards one another. And so I use QGIS. It's got some great add-ons built into it now. I took some of the state site file information, right? So some of the geospatial, just outlines of sites, mainly mound sites, put that into QGIS, cropped out everything, just selected and exported the area we were going to, put some aerial photos underneath that, set up a clicking menu. So when you click on each feature, it tells you basic information. And then QGIS immediately, like in 2 or 3 minutes, can spit out a web map. And so I loaded that onto my website, slapped a little password on it. We went out there. I met the students. I gave them the address. And so as we're walking around the landscape, they get to, on their cell phones, interact with this level of information. They get to see, right, their little marker move around the map. They get to click on the sites. We've got elevation data. I mean, very quickly illustrating to, and this was done on the fly. I mean, this from start to finish, this whole thing, creating a web application of the sites that we were going to look at that tracked the user in real time as they moved across the landscape. This was less than 10 minutes. And that's the sort of stuff that these tools, doing that with paid software is incredibly cumbersome, if not impossible. That's where the open source tools, I mean, we know those user communities are building stuff that user communities want. And so it's no surprise that when we want to do something creative like this and support, in this case, education, it's just right there and I can do it so rapidly.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, let's wrap up this conversation. I've got the feeling that I could ask you a million more questions and I could get a million more really interesting answers, probably about 2 million more really interesting answers. You did a great job of, I started out saying that you were going to talk about GIS based off of the notes that we had, and you brought it right back to GIS and the particular tools you're using and how you're using. So thanks for making my life a lot easier with this interview.
Well, that's I'm happy to do it. That's what I'm here for.
Well, I'm happy that you're doing the work you're doing, and I hope to see more of it in the future. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Archaeotech podcast. Links to items mentioned on the show are in the show notes at www.arcpodnet.com/archaeotech. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com and paul@lugal.com. Support the show by becoming a member at arcpodnet.com/members. The music is a song called Off-Road and is license free from Apple. Thanks for listening.
This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.